Hello everyone and welcome back to Player One Start. You know, one of the most popular genres of video games on the Super Nintendo has to be the fighting games. These games would allow players to engage in intense one-on-one battles with a variety of characters, each with their own unique moves and abilities. Fighting games have been around since the early 80s, but partially due to the technical limitations of the hardware of the time, these games were mainly nothing more than a mild diversion away from some of the other game formats. Where most gamers might find their fun was challenging one of their friends to a playthrough and seeing which one could come out on top. When porting these games to home systems, the technical limitations were even more glaringly obvious. Especially when compared to the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo offered significant improvements in graphics and sound, making the fighting games not only more visually impressive, but also more immersive and enjoyable. One of the biggest advantages to the Super Nintendo over the 8-bit NES is the inclusion of more buttons on the controller, allowing for more complex special moves and combos. So in this generation, I always felt like that if you won or lost a battle, it was more due to your skill other than random chance or luck, as you have the ability to vary up your gameplay so much that you're able to take more ownership over your actions in the game. Many who grew up in the mid-90s would know a lot of the game franchises that made their appearances on the Super Nintendo, including Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. But there are also other games that are fondly remembered today, such as Killer Instinct, and there were several game ports from other fighting games in the arcades. So let's go ahead and dive into a few of these titles. The first series we're going to take a look at is Mortal Kombat. This was a popular fighting game series that debuted in the arcades in 1992, and it quickly became a hit. The biggest draw to this game, besides its unforgettable characters and pre-rendered digitized graphics, was the fact that it included especially violent and gory gameplay. Prior to Mortal Kombat, all but a few of the fighting games had mainly stayed away from blood in their games, but the developers of Mortal Kombat wanted to make their games stand out amongst the crowd. Eventually, the series made its way to home consoles, including the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, with the first entry landing on September 13, 1993, almost an entire year after its arcade debut. I always was envious of kids who were able to have their parents run out and grab them a copy so they can play it at home. However, my parents, not necessarily objecting to the violence in the game or the gore, they didn't end up getting the game because of the cost of a Super Nintendo game back in the day. So it was up to us to rent the game to try it out for ourselves. And while I don't specifically remember the first time we booted up Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, I know for sure that my older brothers would have had a huge problem with the heavy censorship of this title. Prior to release, Nintendo had ordered the censorship of blood and fatalities in the game. What should have been red blood flying off of characters was changed to kind of like an aqua blue kind of sweat. The graphics are also notably downgraded from the arcade version to fit within the limitations of the Super Nintendo. While I see this as a strong criticism of the first title on the Super Nintendo today, despite the censorship and the graphical limitations, the game still managed to capture the essence of the arcade game and introduce players around the world to Mortal Kombat in their home. I think overall, the game still sold well, mainly because I think the expectation of game players for the home system is that it wasn't going to be as good as the home system. Yeah, I kind of understand the fact that kids wouldn't have known why they removed the blood, because if they could actually make it blue sweat, why couldn't they just turn it red? And the fact that blood could be re-added to the Sega Genesis version via a code made this version less desirable to play in retrospect, but back in '93, this would have been just fine for me. Overall, the game reviews actually vary quite deeply between a 7 out of 10 or a 9.6 out of 10, but the main criticisms of this game that I see across all the reviews don't mention the gameplay as being a breaking feature, just the blood and fatalities. So if that's a deal breaker for you, this is not the version of the game you'll want to get. But if not, it's a perfectly competent game to pick up.
Sub-Zero wins.
Shortly after the release of Mortal Kombat on home systems, Mortal Kombat 2 hit the arcades in November of 1993. Again, it would make its way to home consoles the following year, that September in 1994. And let me put it this way, if you were going to play only one video game out of this franchise, Mortal Kombat 2 is the one you want to get. This is hands down one of my favorite fighting games of all time. And in terms of the port on the Super Nintendo, it definitely improved upon the first game's shortcomings. The graphics are more detailed, has more color depth, the gameplay is smoother and faster, the introduction of several new characters to play as, the expanded story and lore of the series. It is just overall a much improved experience over the first Mortal Kombat. Upon its release, several reviewers and game critics alike were very much impressed with the home ports of Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super Nintendo, with some calling it a near-perfect conversion from the arcade to the home. Game reviews of Mortal Kombat 2 for the Super Nintendo also echo how good of a game it is, with most of them ranging between the 9 to 10 out of 10. However, those critics that reviewed the game at a lower score than that were again mainly hung up on the mild censorship issues. I use the term mild as it wasn't as bad as the first Mortal Kombat, but it's still not quite at the arcade level. Again, I would definitely recommend this as an essential fighting game for the Super Nintendo, but I would go a step beyond that and say it's an essential game if you own a Super Nintendo, regardless of the genre.
Superb. Reptile wins.
Expectations for the third Mortal Kombat were understandably high after coming off of the major success of Mortal Kombat 2. And while Mortal Kombat 3 would be a commercial success and receive generally positive reviews, it would draw criticism for omitting several popular characters from previous games, replacing them with new, less appealing characters. To date, it remains the only Mortal Kombat game not to feature franchise mascot Scorpion. Mortal Kombat 3 did add new gameplay mechanics, such as the ability to run and perform chain combos, but again, these were criticized from going off of the moves that players had become accustomed to throughout the first and second entry. The game's difficulty was also criticized, which is considered to be higher than in the previous two games. Overall, though, while this game was still a commercial success, they decided to fix some of the fan criticisms by releasing Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Overall, if you're going to go between the two, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 is the one to go with. However, when looking at review scores of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, the Super Nintendo version is a bit lower rated than the others, coming around a 6 or an 8 out of 10. However, by the time Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 hit store shelves, there was a major transition that was taking place in the video game industry. The game hit the Super Nintendo in June of 1996. By that time, the next generation was in full swing, and the game's graphics no longer looked impressive when compared to the more powerful home hardware. And at that time, though technically impressive things were being done on the Super Nintendo to keep it relevant, as a kid looking between two different versions of this game, one of them being a 16-bit version and one being the 32-bit version of the next generation, I would have thought myself, oh, this one's crap, I should just go with the next generation. But overall, I think Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 provides a nice closure for the 16-bit series, and I am happy to have Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and Ultimate 3 in my collection, but I find myself playing Mortal Kombat 2 the most, but that could be purely out of nostalgia. Street Fighter is one of the most iconic fighting game franchises of all time. It would make its debut in the arcade in 1987, and it would become a commercial success. At that time, Street Fighter introduced things that are more common in fighting games today, and pretty much invented this genre in my opinion, but up until this point, nobody had seen all of these things in the same game. These would be the 6-button fighting control, command-based special moves, and more. Despite its commercial success, it never got a home port on the Nintendo Entertainment System here in the United States, I assume because of the limitations of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The only home port that would make it to the United States was the game Fighting Street, released in 1989 as one of the launch titles for the TurboGrafx CD. However, that would all change with Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. When this game hit arcades, it was credited with revitalizing the declining arcade business. It would become the best-selling arcade game since the golden age of arcade video games. After becoming a huge blockbuster success in the arcades, developer Capcom would develop a home port for these 16-bit systems, starting with the Super Nintendo, releasing in August of 1992. Being billed as the first 16-megabit cartridge to be released for the Super Nintendo, creating an arcade port for the Super Nintendo would prove very challenging due to the limitations in the Super Nintendo's hardware compared to the arcade board. But I think they did a pretty stand-up job. In my memory, this is the first game where I really felt like an arcade fighter had made its way to the home successfully. In Japan, the game would sell more than 1 million copies within the first 2 weeks, becoming a multi-million seller in Japan by that December. When the game launched in the US, it had the price of $74.99, which is probably the reason why, again, this was a constant rental and not a game I owned back in the day. But upon its release, it would also become the top-selling Super Nintendo game for months after its release. Reviews of this game average around 9.5 out of 10, with some giving it a perfect score, and some giving it just slightly less than a perfect score. This is a game I do like to come back to on the Super Nintendo for nostalgia reasons, but it's not really one that I'm playing the most often, because as with any successful property, they would have to make a sequel. Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting was released on the Super Nintendo in 1993 and is an updated version of the original game. This game features faster gameplay, improved graphics, and introduced new moves for some of the characters. This game would also add the ability to play as 4 bosses from the original game. In fact, this entire port was developed using the Super Nintendo port of the original Street Fighter II as its base, but with a larger cartridge size. Even though this game is titled Turbo, it also contains the Champion Edition version of the game in the form of a normal mode. The game does allow you to choose the game's speed, up to 4 different settings, though with my aging reflexes I had to keep it down on the slower mode. I definitely feel like I'm out of practice with this one. This game improves upon so much over its predecessor that I would recommend this game over the original if you're going to only collect one for your system, and this is probably the version I ended up playing most often. Along with being included on lists for best video games of all time, this game again received very high review scores around the 9.5 to 10 out of 10. And is again another game I would recommend as essential for your Super Nintendo, not just for those fans of fighting games.
You lose.
Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers was released in 1994, and it includes new game modes such as Group Battle and Time Challenge, as well as the 8-player tournament mode from the arcade version. Just like with Mortal Kombat, this game is censored with having the blood removed or replaced with sweat due to Nintendo's strict censorship policy at the time. This game does take the game of Street Fighter II and ramp it up to I think its maximum limit, but when looking at game reviews of the time, they're kind of more mild than on the other versions. For example, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave this game a 7 out of 10 average, with all of their reviewers concurring that it was the best version of Street Fighter II to date, but they were wondering why Capcom hadn't put out a Street Fighter III with new mechanics instead. They were also more critical of this game over the Genesis version. But despite their critiques, the game was still a success. I still find it fun to this day, and is another game I'm happy to have in my collection.
You win.
Now, I'm going to be honest, Street Fighter Alpha 2 is not a game that I even knew was released on the Super Nintendo until many years later. This is a game series that I mostly associated with the generation after the 16-bit era. And strangely, as this version was released in 1996, at a time when most third-party publishers had moved on to more CD-based systems, this game was actually published by Nintendo instead of Capcom. And this game is a technical marvel of how they were able to get it to work on the Super Nintendo. This game does use a special chip inside of the cartridge for real-time graphic decompression, which allowed the game to store higher-resed graphics at a much smaller space on the cartridge, but expand them out for when they were needed on screen. While this process is impressive, it added a lot of load times to the game. There are also several pauses where the game has to load music onto the sound chip, which is something that a lot of people on the Super Nintendo would not have been used to seeing. There are other games on the Super Nintendo that rely very heavily on load times, but they are mostly disguised as the load times are relatively short with the high speed of the cartridge. But in this game, there are several times where the game just freezes while it loads, and then it starts going again. It's a bit jarring for me. At the time this game came out, it received an average of around 7.5 out of 10, and I do find this game to be very impressive, and one I'm very happy to have for my Super Nintendo, but out of all the games in the Street Fighter series, this is the one I feel is least essential. It's not the best port of this game by far, but it's also very impressive at how it was done, so I'm marveling at the fact that they're getting this game to run on this system at the level they are. Back at the time this game came out, everyone else had moved on to the next generation, but I felt like I was still stuck on the Super Nintendo, as we didn't get a PlayStation until 1999. So if my video rental store had had this back in the day, I would have been ecstatic to be playing a game that felt like a next-gen experience. There are a plethora of other fighting games to get to on this system, but I really wanted to make sure we spent the time to take a look at two of the most popular franchises, well, because out of all the fighting franchises, I think these two are the ones that most people have played at least once who grew up during this time period. And as I've said before, fighting games aren't really my favorite genre on any system, and playing them by yourself is not really recommended either, as I really feel like they're only fun if you play it with another person. Granted, depending on the skill level of that person, you may have a good time or you may have a bad time with it. Either way, we're going to split the video off here, and in the next part we're going to finish up with the rest of the fighting games that I plan to showcase on the Super Nintendo. So as I remind you to leave a like on this video on your way out, please leave a comment below on which of these two franchises you think is superior to the other, Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.